Alright, so the iPhone 13 Pro has been considered by many to be a relatively minor update to Apple's iPhone lineup this year. A lot of people have compared it to the iPhone S models of days gone by. The 13 Pro retains the same design language of the previous 12 Pro, except with some under-the-hood upgrades. It's easy to mistake these background updates to be just minor, and the iPhone has gotten so good at being a smartphone that many just don't even pay much attention to new releases unless it's with a radical aesthetic change. Heck, my housemates didn't even realize that there was a new iPhone until I had literally received the 13 Pro in hand. But these seamlessly minor updates are precisely how the iPhone has developed into the smartphone that absolutely nails the fundamentals and is the reason why I made the jump. That's right, after 10 years of daily driving Android phones, this was the model that made me switch, and I have some thoughts. Firstly, let's talk about that one fundamental aspect of a smartphone that for me personally needs to be absolutely nailed for me to enjoy the phone on a day-to-day basis. This is of course the screen. This year, Apple finally made the leap and integrated ProMotion into the displays of the 13 Pro and Pro Max. Coming from Android phones with 90Hz and 120Hz displays, a 60Hz display like the one found in the iPhone 13 felt like a substantial downgrade. I had outlined this in my iPhone 12 review from last year, noting animations to be noticeably less smooth. Having used the 13 Pro's new 120Hz ProMotion display, it's been admittedly a fairly underwhelming experience, but purely because I'm already so used to high refresh rate screens to begin with. Ultimately, it functions as claimed and acted as the stepping stone for me to say, okay, maybe now I'll give the iPhone a shot. I will say as a quick aside, Apple's ability to contextually ramp up and down the refresh rate from 10 to 120 frames per second is absolutely superb. I honestly can only count half a dozen times where I've seen slowdowns, and in addition, I don't think I've come across an app that has not yet supported the high refresh rate. As to the other aspects of the screen, Apple claims that the display in everyday use can get up to 1000 nits of sustained brightness versus the 800 nits of the previous 12 Pro. In HDR, peak brightness increases to 1200 nits. Realistically speaking though, the display's brightness is by no means any better than other flagships like the Samsung S21, and even against my 3-year-old OnePlus 7 Pro, only in the harshest sunlight will you notice a perceivable difference. Contrast and viewing HDR footage is again a similar story. It looks great on the 13 Pro, but similarly great on something like the S21. Now the notch on the 13 Pro is ever so slightly less wide, but to be perfectly clear, it alongside the relatively thick bezels is a major downgrade in comparison to my previous Android phones. The one saving grace is that I can get back to using a tempered glass screen protector, which generally is not easily applicable to phones with a in-display fingerprint scanner or curved displays. Overall, the 13 Pro screen, whilst a substantial upgrade from the previous iPhone models, remains unremarkable in the sea of Android phones with equally fast, bright, and color-accurate displays. Okay, so let's talk about the second fundamental improvement Apple has made in this year's iPhone 13 Pro: battery life. This undoubtedly was one of the most noticeable differences for myself coming from previous phones. The battery life on this model is absolutely bonkers. I've been hitting comfortably 5 to 6 hours of screen on time with still 30 to 40% remaining battery life at the end of the day. In comparison, on my previous Samsung S21 and my OnePlus 7 Pro, I would be averaging around 4 to 5 hours a day, which would usually require me to plug into my car on my commutes to and from work. It's funny, I recently got a dodgy bedside lamp over there, and it has an inbuilt wireless charger which only really charges the iPhone up to 50% half the time, and even in that situation, I'm able to get through a whole workday with about 20% of battery remaining when I get home. On a full charge, the 13 Pro allows me to do things that I would not think about doing on my previous phones. For example, I can increase the auto lock time to 5 minutes, so I don't get annoyed that I have to unlock the phone after walking away to get something in the kitchen, for example. I can watch YouTube videos endlessly whilst doing house chores, and I can set the screen at high brightness. It's fantastic. The one thing that would have made this phone neck level is fast charging, but alas, it's not here. Ultimately, the lack of fast charging is countered by this fantastic battery life. Fast charging is missed? but it's not a deal breaker. Okay, so the third fundamental improvement in the 13 Pro has to be, of course, the cameras. To cut to the chase, the camera bunk is chonk. But the video is amazing. It's best in class and it's leagues above anything I've ever used on any other phone. Photos, on the other hand, while still excellent, are just on par in terms of quality and features compared to other flagships. So first, let's talk about video. The 13 Pro offers up to 4K Dolby Vision HDR at 60 frames per second. On paper, this seems a relatively similar offering compared to the competition. But in real life, the 13 Pro not only delivers on the promise of ultra-sharp high dynamic range footage, but does so across all 4 cameras, including the selfie shooter. It has buttery smooth stabilization, minimal rolling shutter, smooth exposure transitions, and reliable autofocus. All of this is maintained even in challenging low light situations. In addition, the onboard microphone is also excellent, with the only gripe being the fact that it struggles with wind noise. Checking out the following footage, you can see the obvious difference between the S21 and the iPhone. Given those demonstrations, I could easily imagine myself using solely the iPhone to record travel footage, for example. And that's coming from someone who owns a Sony mirrorless camera setup. The iPhone just makes it easy. It produces amazing and accurate footage that leaves little need for color or stabilization editing. Editing me here to quickly also mention something that I forgot to talk about in the main review, that if you are into photo editing, there's the ability for you to record actually in ProRes footage now. This will offer you more accurate colors as it records in 10-bit 422, and also slightly more flexibility with color grading, dynamic range, and sharpening. Great for creators, but just be wary that it will significantly impact your storage capacity due to larger file sizes, plus you are also limited to 4K 30 frames per second rather than 60 frames per second. If you're lazy like me, I think it's totally fine to just shoot videos without ProRes and call it a day, but it's a nice bonus to have. Essentially, the video recording capabilities is really the other main reason that pushed me towards the iPhone 13 Pro, and maybe the one that keeps me from switching back to Android. Just keep in mind that such video recording is also available in the last generation of iPhone Pros, so I would not recommend upgrading to the 13 Pro if you own one of those phones for the cameras alone. As a quick aside, the new cinematic mode, which allows you to add in a shallow depth of field and focus switching, it's still a bit gimmicky. For example, it's just terrible at edge detection involving hair, and it records only in 1080p 30 frames per second. Pick the right subject, the right amount of depth of field, and the appropriate timing of focus switching, and it can work wonders. Now, let's talk about photos. The iPhone takes great pictures, but they aren't leagues ahead of the competition like the video recording is. In fact, I find that the most beneficial aspects of the new 13 Pro's camera quality is these new photographic styles, which allows you to customize your preference of warmth and contrast to your images. The effect is that the iPhone will take in mind those preferences whenever it takes a photo, adjusting the processing of the image to whatever matches your preference. For me, this allows you to not only have the benefits of a flagship camera, such as sharpness, fast apertures for capturing movement and reducing noise, but also that flexibility to maintain those features with your preference of color and contrast baked right into the processing. Editing me back again to mention a couple of extra notes. All 3 rear cameras have new and improved sensors from previous generations. The main camera is obviously the shining beacon of them all, having great sharpness, low light performance, and dynamic range. The ultra-wide is significantly sharper in comparison to its predecessors, but ultimately its performance rivals that of flagships like the Samsung S21, at least in good light. The portrait lens offers roughly a 77mm full frame equivalent field of view, which is super nice to get that bit of dramatic compression in your pictures, but the sharpness and noise performance is equal to that of the ultra-wide. So if you're zooming in, you'll notice some pretty aggressive noise reduction given that oil, waxy paint appearance. Some other negatives to the camera that I also need to mention. Number one, The selfie camera is rather soft and also lacks any gesture-based self-timer like in Samsung phones. This can be a little bit annoying for those awkward selfies where you may be struggling to hit the shutter button or volume toggle. Ultimately, it's just a quality of life thing. Number 2, the menu system is rather janky and it's a bit hard to get your head around. For example, the arrow facing upwards as being the indicator for the manual settings, it just doesn't make logistical sense. Number 3, night mode tends to be a bit too dark for my liking. So night mode pictures will be true to life in terms of brightness, however this means in some situations they are just way too dark. For example, if you're taking an image of your friends in a dimly lit environment, it might just need to be a little brighter for actually seeing the subjects. Number 4, dynamic range can sometimes be lacking in comparison to other flagships. Now to be fair, these last 2 points, it's more of a personal preference kind of thing and can be circumvented by shooting in Pro RAW. Essentially, this is where the pictures are formatted into an editable DMG file. So in photo editing software, you get more flexibility in terms of dynamic range, brightness, and white balance without as much degradation in the image quality. Pro RAW, just to be clear, does not actually produce a true RAW file, as Apple still imposes their own AI photo modifications to it, but it does allow for some changes to the picture that would otherwise degrade the image quality. And in the example footage here, you can obviously see a more accurate and cleaner picture from the RAW file versus the JPEG. I must say overall though, the cameras work as advertised, and I do find other benefits to Apple software such as a decent portrait mode that doesn't struggle to detect the subject, as well as being able to maintain a similar white balance between all 3 different lenses. Overall, for picture taking quality, a definite thumbs up, but certainly not the reason why you should be upgrading to the iPhone alone. That goes to things such as the video taking capabilities, the screen, and the battery life. Regarding performance, Apple's phone processors have always been considered reliable and fast. The new A15 Bionic chip in the 13 Pro is no different. Having tested the iPhone 12 from last year, yes, there are minor updates to photo video editing and gaming performance, but there is little to no difference in day-to-day use. Whilst navigating through the UI feels more fluid than on predecessor phones, that can all be attributable to the newer 120Hz display. So don't fall into the trap of thinking it's because you are getting massive performance gains in the CPU. In fact, the GPU still struggles to maintain above 60 frames per second on high graphics setting when playing Genshin Impact for more than 10 minutes. So for those of you who are thinking that you could crack that 120 frames per second barrier on the 13 Pro, sorry to disappoint. RAM still remains the same at 6GB, however, given how fast the Bionic chip is, I'd make the argument that even if there was the occasional app that was still not maintained in memory, it would usually load right back up in less than a second, making the lack of upgrade in RAM not really an issue. Now, the design of the iPhone is retained with all but a slightly thicker body. It's a hefty and boxy design with IP68 certified dust and water resistance, and it's bordered by a glossy aluminium fingerprint magnet sidewell with a matte black back that is super luxe. It feels solid in the hand and the build quality is top notch. With a case on for the last 3 months, the back and sides remain scratch free, and it also conveniently gets rid of that infamous desk wobble. I should also mention that button placement is fairly decent. The power button is quite large and in a comfortable position that's not too high up on the phone. The volume rocker is on the opposite side, has nice tactility, but occasionally I will inadvertently click it alongside the power button, causing it to take a screenshot. The notification slider on the side, just above the volume rocker, is so good. I missed it on my S21 and I absolutely love it on my OnePlus 7 Pro. I think more manufacturers should include it on their phones because it's just a nice tactile way of silencing the phone when, for example, you don't have the time to find the toggle in the quick settings. The stereo speakers are very decent and get pretty loud. They're slightly louder than my S21 and OnePlus 7 Pro, which means that I'm often using my 13 Pro more to watch YouTube videos, thanks also in part to its fantastic battery life. Other things that remain are very much in keeping with Apple's previous iPhone traits. For example, Face ID is still here. It works fine, but I still think it's way less convenient than a fingerprint sensor, particularly in this new age of mask wearing. The Lightning port is still a Lightning port. No USB-C port because, again, it's Apple. Why make everyone's life convenient by integrating a universal port into the iPhone that you yourself, Apple, introduced in the MacBook when you could make a bucket load selling cables on an old, slow, outdated pre-existing port. Again, just Apple things. Now, when it comes to the software experience in general, I have found for the most part it's been pretty reliable, but also not perfect. Occasionally there have been little freezes here and there. Some apps have bugs, including not being able to open attachments from Gmail, and I have a lot of gripes about the way iOS is set up. But this is still coming from myself, who has had a decade-long experience of using Android phones. I might make a video about the switch to iOS and the things I found good and bad about it from a software perspective, so let me know in the comment section below if that's something you'd like to see. If you are already a die-hard Apple fan, or you're just used to using an iPhone, this is a non-issue for you. iOS is just iOS, and 99% of the time it will work as advertised. Finally, when it comes to making a purchase decision, I think the 13 Pro offers a lot more to the average iOS user than meets the eye. Sure, it doesn't have a flashy new design, it doesn't have any brand new iPhone feature ever seen before, and it hasn't managed to integrate M1 into the chipset or something like that. What it does do is it nails the fundamentals. If you are after a phone that has great battery life, amazing cameras for photo and video shooting, a bright, fast, color accurate display, great performance, and solid build quality, this is the phone for you. If, however, you need to save money, or you are after a new and exciting form factor, the Android space has so many options available for you. From my experience, you can get 95% of what the iPhone is in less than half the cost in, say, something like the Galaxy S21. In fact, for me, I may choose to move on from my 13 Pro as I'm struggling to justify the additional cost for essentially the better video recording capabilities, the better battery life, and the mildly better performance capabilities that I only ever see in the very infrequent mobile gaming I do. But alas, that's a decision for me another day. Instead, let me know what your thoughts on the iPhone 13 Pro are. Has Apple's foray into high refresh rate displays finally tipped you into making the switch like me? Or was it something else like the battery life or the cameras? Or have you stuck with your current phone at the moment? Comment in the section below and make sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos to come. But until the next one, see ya.